This is Dr. Rich Schuttler with lesson number 11 of 12 lessons inside Chapter 3, the Methodology chapter section. This lesson is titled Data Analysis Plan. In this lesson, I'll address the data analysis plan. I will be giving you insights on how you can take your data analysis plan and provide that in your own chapter in a manner that will help the reader understand exactly what you plan to do once your data is collected and you look to analyze it and then present the information later in Chapter 4. I'll also share several examples from prior mentees of mine who have gone through and graduated already, but you'll be able to see how they alluded to their own data analysis plan. And I'll conclude this lesson with a reflective summary. The data analysis plan is basically where you, as a popular saying goes, is you plan your work, then you work your plan. While you are writing a proposal that only has 3 chapters, at the end of Chapter 3, it's paramount that you describe how you're going to analyze the data once it's collected, realizing that you have not collected your data yet at the proposal stage, but when your proposal is approved, the faculty members that you're working with, perhaps as your committee members, and the university wants to know how you're going to take the data once you have it and then put it into some sort of test, whether it's a statistical test or whether it's going to be done through qualitative software. Ideally, what you're helping the reader to understand as you conclude your proposal is that you're aware of what you're going to do with the data when you get it. You have to remember, once you get your IRP approval at your university and they allow you to start collecting your data, there's nobody other than your dissertation chair and committee members that are going to work with you to be able to be sure you know what to do with the data. What you're doing is forward looking into Chapter 4 at the end of Chapter 3. You should have enough information about your research method and design to know at this point when you're writing this section in Chapter 3 what you plan to do with the data later once it's all collected. And I'll share information and insights about that in this particular lesson. This section about the data analysis plan used more commonly than not found at the end of Chapter 3 before the conclusion section. This is after you've already alluded to how you're going to go about collecting your data. You're going to have 2 to 5 paragraphs of information that's going to describe to other people what you're going to do with that data to analyze it once you have it all, which will then allow you to write Chapter 4 later. This is found at the end of the chapter, as I mentioned, Chapter 3, and it's giving the reader a sense of the preview of what will follow in Chapter 4. Now, once you collect your data and you put your dissertation together, you may have to go back into Chapter 3 and adjust this if, in fact, something occurred different than what you suggested it would be. Oftentimes, students forget to add this section at the end of Chapter 3, and they do not get their proposals approved. We understand that you have not collected data yet, and so it may be kind of a guess on what you're going to do, but it should be an educated guess. You know if you're going to do a quantitative survey, what statistical tests you're going to run when you get the data. You'll know whether you intend to do regression analysis or not, which is, in essence, part of your data analysis plan. If you're doing quantitative work, and let's just say you're going to be conducting open-ended interviews, you're going to take the transcripted data, and what are you going to do with that? Before you go into collecting the data, you'll already have an understanding that more than likely you're going to be having the recordings done from the interview sessions, have them transcribed, and then you're going to do something with that data. Maybe you're going to analyze it yourself, or you're going to put it into NVivo or Atlas type, a software program. But you should know and be able to articulate that as you conclude Chapter 3. Now, this is only 2 to 5 paragraphs. It's not a lot of information. It's just enough to give somebody an understanding that you know what you're going to do once you get the data. If you have what I might call a simple study, perhaps just a quantitative or a qualitative study, you may only need 2 paragraphs. Depending on the complexity of the surveys and what you're doing, it may be more than 2 paragraphs, but in most cases, I haven't seen any that's more than 5 unless somebody was just elaborating a little bit more than perhaps they needed to. When you're providing your data analysis plan, you're showing that you have the discerning critical thinking skills of a researcher. Remember, as you're doing your proposal and dissertation, you're writing a research report. You're not writing an assignment as a student. So you're writing as a researcher. And it shows, in this case, with your data analysis plan, that you have thought through your research method and design well enough to know what you plan to do with the data once you get it. One of the worst things that could happen is you could plan to do a study, get your proposal approved, go collect the data, and not know what to do with it. This is not uncommon, believe it or not, because oftentimes people are so focused on getting their proposal approved and indicating what they're going to do and the steps that are required, and they forget about what they're going to do once they have the data. Once you become somewhat of an expert in your own research method and design that you're applying in your dissertation, you'll become a little bit more in tune with understanding what kind of data is going to come out of the testing that you're going to do once you have your data. In the data analysis plan, it helps to provide information about once the data is collected, then what? Just ask that question to yourself. Once your data collection is done, what are you going to do with all the data? You're probably going to have some demographic data. You're going to have some data that either comes from interviews or Likert type survey questions, or maybe even both. If you're like me, you'll have a mixed method study, and you're going to have Likert type question data to respond and develop into some sort of information. You're also going to have the open-ended questions, and you're going to then perhaps even do triangulation as I did. Now these are all different types of data that come from each one of them. You have to explain to a certain level of detail, not so much excruciating detail, but enough information so the reader gets the sense that you know what you're going to do with the data once it's collected. What's your plan? The best thing to do is have a plan. The most successful businesses have plans. The most successful people in the world have their own individual plans. If you're not as successful in moving through your dissertation as you'd like to be, I'd encourage you to think about your plan. Do you actually have one written out about timelines and how long you want to take for each section? Oftentimes, we go back to looking at a student who's not doing very well or not completing their program on time, and we realize that they don't really have a plan, or they have a plan that's not realistic, or they had a plan and they forgot to update it along the way, so therefore the plan is out of date. Same thing happens here with your data analysis plan. You're going to put this plan together. Once you collect your data, you're going to go back and look at your plan. Now, things may change. When I did my dissertation, I only had it designed initially for a quantitative Likert type question series and several open-ended questions. I did not have at the time triangulation included. Once I collected my data, I was led by my committee members to include triangulation. So as I wrote my dissertation, after the data was collected, I had to go back into chapter 3 and add information in there about triangulation because I didn't do my research exactly as I proposed. For some, you might find that for your data analysis plan, flowchart it first. Oftentimes people are visual, and there's nothing wrong with having a flowchart that suggests your data analysis plan. This is much like your research map that you had perhaps created earlier in this series on chapter 3. I had one lesson completely dedicated to an actual research map, which is really nothing more than a flowchart. You may find that creating a flowchart for your data analysis plan is a good way for you to first show the figure and then write to each step to complete your chapter in such a manner in this section. You may also decide that you want to include that flowchart as a figure inside of your chapter 3. There's nothing wrong with that. If that flowchart or the figure you're going to add brings more value to your work, then I encourage you to do so. I encourage people to have a research map early in chapter 3, as well as having a data analysis plan flowchart figure at the end of chapter 3. Now, some will include the actual data analysis plan in the research map. There's nothing wrong with that. If you do that, then all you have to do is refer back to the figure that you have earlier in the chapter. You're going to have to look at your data analysis plan from two perspectives. Remember, you're going to do a pilot study. From that pilot study, you're going to have some outcomes. What kind of data? It may be nothing more than people giving you information about how well your questions are designed, or if they're valid, they're going to actually produce the type of data you want. But there's going to be some sort of data or information out of the pilot. You need to address that in this section. Yes, earlier in chapter 3, you did write about how you're going to do your pilot study and the rationale for doing your pilot study. If you address what you're going to do with the data from that pilot study, you may not need to actually put it here again at the end of the chapter, but you might want to in an abbreviated piece, because oftentimes somebody might just read this section, and if they're not sure what you're going to do with the pilot analysis data, then what they're going to have to do is go back earlier in the chapter 3 and read it from the beginning. Then, of course, your data analysis plan has to relate to the actual research study outcomes that you have. Again, whether that's from a quantitative or qualitative outcome, even if you're using secondary data and you're running some sort of test on that, perhaps you're looking at averages or means or modes, or you're trying to take something else and run a statistical analysis. No matter what's going to happen, you're going to be collecting data somehow or coming up with some sort of analysis based on information that's already available. You have to, in chapter 3, prescribe to the reader what your intentions are with the data once it's all collected. Demographic data analysis plan. Now, oftentimes I encourage my mentees to have a couple different plans depending on the type of data. Now, granted, if you're going to do a quantitative study, it makes it relatively easy. If you're doing just a qualitative, again, that's relatively easy. But you're still going to have some demographic information. That data analysis is going to be different than how you're going to run all your other analysis. For example, you may be doing a quantitative study, but you're not going to do any statistical testing on demographic data. You're going to report the demographic data, perhaps in pie charts. Perhaps you're going to do it by averages or some sort of mean or mode, depending on what you're relating to. Whereas in a statistical analysis, when you're running statistical testing on your Likert type questions to test your null hypothesis or hypotheses, that data analysis plan is different. So take a look at breaking it down into different types of data that you're going to analyze. Again, you're going to have pilot study data. You're going to have demographic data. You're going to have the actual research data that comes from the questions that you're going to ask, whether it be in a quantitative or qualitative research method. Data analysis plan for the quantitative, basically what you need to prescribe is once the data is collected, what statistical test are you going to run and why? Are you going to be doing a chi-square or a t-test? Are you going to do regression analysis? It's important that you just provide the information about what tests you plan and why. Again, it's the rationale that's important. We want to know if you decide you're going to run a t-test, why are you going to run the t-test? What's the rationale for that? Remember, it's about details. What kind of details? Yes, excruciating details in chapter 3. If you're going to be doing a qualitative study, you might want to indicate here whether or not you're going to use software, such as in vivo software. Now, you can do the same thing in quantitative. If you're going to use SPSS or you're going to do some data transferring from Excel, you might want to include that in there. I think that's important. But it's also important here at qualitative. Now, when I did my qualitative analysis, I did it by hand, where I created affinity diagrams and then put all the information to like type categories to find my themes, which is really all the qualitative software does automatically. Depends on how you want to do it, but if you're going to use a qualitative software or the quantitative software for the quantitative study in the data analysis section, just indicate which one you're using. And I think it's important that if you're going to be using Vivo, for example, what version? So you might want to put in vivo version 10, or perhaps you have an older version, version 8. Just put that down in this section as well. And you'll see this in an example from one of my mentees in a few moments. Also, you have to keep in mind about data saturation testing. When you do your data analysis plan, it's important that in qualitative work, if you're going to do perhaps, let's say, a phenomenological study, ideally, I tell my mentees to put in there that they're going to have planned to do 20 interviews or until data saturation occurs. How is that going to happen? How are you going to know when data saturation testing occurs? How are you going to manage that? As I tell my mentees, is Put all the information into the software or do it manually, but do not run any of the data and do not look for anything until after they've done at least 12 interviews. Once they do 12 interviews, and I encourage them to run the software, find out what the major themes are, the nodes that are produced. Then do 3 more interviews or 4 more interviews. Let's just say you stopped at 12, you ran all the data. Then you made a plan to do 4 more interviews. After that 4th one, you add it into the system with the other 12. Then you determine, are any new themes or new information or new nodes produced? If yes, then that's great. Then you continue and do 4 more interviews and put the data in. And you do that as many times as it takes till you have no more new themes coming out. If by chance at 12 you ran your information, then you did 4 more, and no new information came out, no new themes or no new nodes, then I suggest you stop there. That would be data saturation. That means you tested at 12, you did 4 more, you found no more, and therefore you can claim with a reasonable expectation that data saturation has occurred. You no longer need to go to 20. Inside the qualitative data analysis plan, you do need to describe how you're going to manage the transcription and the organization of the data into common themes. Is somebody going to transcribe the interviews for you? If so, who? If it's somebody else, then make sure they sign a confidentiality agreement so that they're not going to share the information with anybody. Remember, you have to protect for the confidentiality and for people's names in your work. In the qualitative design, it's not uncommon that some person, a third party other than you, will do the transcription. How are you going to take those transcriptions? For example, if you interviewed 12 people, ideally you would take all the information from the transcriptions from all 12 of those people for question number 1 and put that into NVivo software. And then you would run it to see what was produced. After you did 4 more interviews, you again take the same thing, all the answers for question number 1 from those transcriptions, put it in there and run it again. You have to describe to a certain level of detail how you're going to go about this. This is important. You can't just take all the information from the transcriptions and put it into a software because you've asked a number of different questions. You have to run the themes and gain the information from the data for each individual question to be able to answer your research questions. Are you going to be applying triangulation? As I indicated, I ended up doing triangulation, but I didn't plan for it in my proposal, so I had to go back into chapter 3 when I produced my dissertation to share exactly how I went about this. Now in my case, I went into the return survey population and interviewed 5% of the people. Roughly I had, if I'm not mistaken, about 830 return surveys. I went to talk to 5% of those people. Roughly, I think it was around 17 people I went to talk to. And what I did with triangulation is I took the information from the quantitative and qualitative portions of the survey that I sent out. I took the data analysis from that and the information I produced, and I went into that 5% of the survey population to find out if they agreed with me or not, or if they agreed with the data that suggested the information that I had. Idealistically, they should because they were part of that survey population. But if I would have talked to people and they would have had a different point of view or gave me different answers than what the data suggested, then that would help me to understand that perhaps my data was not as reliable as it should be otherwise. Triangulation has many different values that it holds to the researcher. What you need to do in Chapter 3, if you're going to do triangulation, is describe your data analysis plan for what you're going to provide in this triangulation and how it's going to be matched, if you will. If you're going to be testing a new model, first in this section, near the end of Chapter 3, you need to give the model first. You may have already done this in Chapter 2 of your literature review, but if you're going to test the new model, it's important that you share the information again at the end of Chapter 3 so people can see the new model that you're testing. Now, if it's a model that's already been tested and you're just using somebody else's survey, this does not necessarily apply. Very few people actually test a new model in a dissertation. Ideally, dissertations are not about testing a model or creating a model. It's about providing information that perhaps later can be used to create a model, but there are different types of research where you can test a model. I tested my model, but I also did not do it as a dissertation project. I did it as my own research project where I created the model first. Then, with Dr. Ruby Rouse's help, we created a survey that was designed to be able to test the model. Now, this is different, again, than doctoral dissertation research, but if you're going to have a model, please include that in at the end of Chapter 3 in your data analysis plan. Do you need some help for some of this? It's not uncommon that people do. Most doctoral students are not researchers by trade. That's why you're here at the university level to learn. One piece of information, a lot of resources to it, is Sage Research Methods Online. In your online library or at any library, you can get access to this. You can also gain information to it by going through Google and just searching for Sage Research Methods Online. But if you want to subscribe to it there, it's going to cost you. Most online libraries through universities have access to this. If you have a chance, go to a library. Ask the librarians for help. Tell them that you need information related to data analysis plans. They will help you find exactly what you need. There's also ProQuest Dissertations online. In one of your online resources in your electronic library at the university where you belong to, look for ProQuest Dissertations. I encourage you to download one or two, perhaps maybe three, recent dissertations published from your university that has the research method and design that you plan to apply. Then look at how they did their data analysis plan, and you might find information in there that you can emulate or incorporate into how you plan on doing your work. And of course, there are these course textbooks that you get in research. Now, I understand that those textbooks are pretty generic, and you may not find a lot of information about a data analysis plan as you need to have it for your doctoral dissertation work. Matter of fact, I would encourage you even to stay away from some of these how-to dissertation books. They may be giving you information, but oftentimes it's not enough for your specific plan that you have to put together. And this is why I believe oftentimes by going back into other dissertations that were recently published at your university, you'll see basically what they're approving, thus you get a better understanding of their expectations. And if you know the expectations, it's easier for you to meet and exceed those expectations. And perhaps you might look at getting a research tutor. Oftentimes a research tutor can help you make a lot of progress. And oftentimes you may pay a research tutor far less than $50 an hour. Perhaps you meet with this research tutor a couple hours a week for maybe a month or two. That is still going to cost you less than repeating another course at your university to continue on with your studies. Research tutors are easy to find. You can go to any university, perhaps in your neighborhood. You have a state university or a city university. Go and look and speak to somebody, perhaps, or call somebody in the research department. Tell them that you're looking to hire a research tutor. Oftentimes they have research assistants that are willing to do this. Just make sure you get one that has expertise in your research method and design. One of my mentees went through Craigslist, put an advertisement there, found several within a couple days, contracted with one, and sat with that person every Friday for a couple hours and made much progress. Within 2 months, was basically done with the proposal and the data collection, as well as writing Chapter 4. So oftentimes it's that tutor that can give you a hand. What I'm going to do now is share several examples from some of my mentees. As I always say, that these examples, the content is theirs. Their work was approved on the first passes because they did hard work, and they own the copyright. They just have given me written consent to use their work as part of this program to help others learn as well. They were kind enough to share their insights and information. If you find their work valuable, I encourage you to download their dissertations. And if you find even more value, then perhaps drop them an email. Let them know how much value their work had to you. The first example I'll share is from Dr. Patricia Schroeder, whose dissertation was published in 2013. The title of her dissertation is A Quantitative Correlation Study of Individualism, Collectivism, and Employee Innovations in Turkey. She wrote, after data collection was completed, the employee creativity innovation items were evaluated for reliability using the Cronbach alpha. For the scale to be considered sufficiently reliable, the items needed to have a Cronbach alpha of at least 0.70 alpha, and she cited Newman, 2010. Now remember, this is a published dissertation, so everything's in the past tense. But if you're writing your proposal, all you would indicate is the kind of test that you're going to run, and that for it to be sufficiently reliable, that you would have to have that alpha of at least 7D. She indicated descriptive statistics were then used to evaluate whether the study's main variables were normally distributed. In your proposal, if this was for you, you would say something like descriptive statistics are going to be applied once the data is collected. She went on to say variables with a skew of less than 2 were considered sufficient normal. She cited Steinberg. Here, if you want more information on that, go into Steinberg and find out information about how descriptive statistics can be tested and used. And suitable for inferential statistics. If any of the main variables were not normally distributed, the data analysis plan would be updated. She continued on with saying, since the creativity innovation items have not been previously tested, Cronbach's alpha was used to evaluate the reliability of these items. To be considered sufficiently reliable, the creativity innovation items should have an alpha of at least 0.70. No inferential statistics were computed until the reliability of the dependent variable creativity was determined. So you get a sense for the step-by-step process she went through. She did basically the same thing in the proposal, saying what she was going to do depending on how the data came in. Then she continued on, as shown in Table 1, research question 1, 2, and 3 were ordinal scaled items. As a result, Spearman's RHO rather than a Pearson's correlation was most appropriate statistic for evaluating the first 3 research questions. To be considered statistically significant, the correlations needed to have a probability of 0.05 or lower to ensure 95% confidence in the findings. Gives, again, the same citation. You can get a sense for what she planned to do with the research questions. If you want to see exactly how she did this, please consider going back to the page that has her name and dissertation and go ahead and download it from ProQuest Dissertations. She finally concluded with, since research question 4 examined regions, analysis of variance was used to compare differences in cultural orientation, leadership, and creativity. In alignment with Hofstede's 2008 recommendation, the study goal was to include at least 20 participants to represent each of the 7 regions in Turkey. The mean scores of each variable in each region were compared to determine if there were statistically significant differences. Again, you can get a sense for exactly the details she included. Now, these are what kind of details? Yep, excruciating details. And all this is out of Chapter 3 of her dissertation, not Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is just presenting the information or the data that's collected. It's not about giving all this kind of information. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee, in his award-winning dissertation, 2013, titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study, gives this information. The data collected through the surveys were loaded into Microsoft Excel and the IBM SPSS software tools for statistical analysis. Initially, statistics were calculated on the demographic data variables to describe the sample characteristics. So if you were doing this in a proposal, you would indicate that you're going to use Microsoft Excel and SPSS. He continued on indicating that significant tests consisted of 2 categories: a parametric test, which are primarily derived from the ratio and interval data, and B, the non-parametric tests used with ordinal and nominal measurements, and cites Aaron, ETAL, in 2011. Again, you get a sense for basically what kind of test he used and why. He continued on with chi-square has an upper limit of infinity and a lower limit of 0, meaning no association. Each religion was coded to conduct the t-test. The Pearson Product Movement Correlation Coefficient, also known as the Pearson R, and the Spearman Rho RS were calculated for religiosity in each of the 5 dimensions of leadership practices and for religiosity and their leadership practice scores. So you can see he's talking about the chi-square and the types of tests that he ran. The mean and standard deviation were calculated to determine how tightly distributed the sample was around the mean to confirm the differences in leadership practices of organizational leaders based on their religion. And he cites Cooper and Schindler in 2011. Multiple regression tests were used to determine if the leaders practices could be predicted based on an organization's leader's religion, religiosity, or other factors. So in his proposal, he knew he was going to run multiple regression tests, and he indicated as such. And of course, now this is the dissertation. He's showing you, or explaining to you, if you will, exactly what happened. Now, finally, in Dr. Susan Kristeniak's example I'll share with you from 2011 in her dissertation titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a Qualitative Phenomenological Study, she expressed this information. Creswell, 2007, reported that qualitative data analysis consists of describing and capturing information and determining themes. The goal of the data analysis is to involve appropriate interpretation and distillation of the data to determine the themes. Theme identification's constant analysis enabled the research to contribute to the body of knowledge on the experiences of complementary therapy nurses and their perceptions of their satisfaction at wellness and healing environments. Remember, she had a phenomenological study, so we're looking at, of course, perceptions. She went on to indicate this identification can add to the richness of the transformation of leadership skills for present and future healthcare leaders. As we conclude this lesson, I'm wanting to always help you to better understand that Chapter 3 helps the reader understand about your critical thinking. Chapter 3 relates at the basic foundational level in a sense that shows your discerning knowledge of research. Not only that you have a knowledge of how you're going to do what you're going to do with your research steps, but you understand the rationale for each steps, and once you collect the data from each of those steps, what you're going to do with that data. You must become that expert in your research method. You have to have a certain amount of subject matter expertise with your research method and design. That's why it's important, perhaps more so after you write Chapter 2, is to spend more time than reading books and articles, particularly research reports, about research efforts that related to the actual method and design that you're going to use. You'll learn much from that, become more of an expert by doing that. Remember, you're moving from becoming a student to becoming a researcher. You may be that academic researcher that's being guided, but you're becoming a researcher nonetheless. The end result of Chapter 3, it helps to inform others of your choices and the rationale for your choices. It helps the reader to understand that you have at least the basic knowledge needed to be able to conduct your research, and you know what you're going to do with the data once you have conducted your research. And we're always looking for what kind of details in Chapter 3? Yep, excruciating details. Remember, what are you going to do, how are you going to do it, and why you're going to do it. Most students who fail to get their work approved on the first time through at the proposal stage is usually because they've given the first two. This is what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. They forget on why, the rationale. So make sure you don't forget that. Include that in your data analysis plan and make sure the reader understands what you're going to do and why you're going to do that. I want to give just a quick reflective summary. I gave some insights from the data analysis plan on how you can potentially write to your chapter with this information. It's beyond the scope to be able to teach all the different things for each item I addressed, but by the time you get to this part in Chapter 3, you'll have known more and learned more about all your research method and design intricacies. If perhaps you're still working on Chapter 1, but you're listening to this lesson plan, regardless, keep in mind, you'll learn this as you move farther down the line. Examples I shared were from my mentees. Each of them gave me written permission to use their work. I encourage you to look for Dr. Schroeder's or Dr. Hagee's or Dr. Kristeniak's dissertations or ProQuest dissertations online if that happens to be related to your dissertation research method and design. Then go ahead and download one of them. I do believe that education is a lot like life, that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. Continue to work on your proposal, making it as rich as possible, realizing that your dissertation is the same way, that the more you put into it now, the more you're going to get out of it later. And more so, the more other people are going to get out of it as well. This is the program titled Taking the B Out of ABD, which stands for Taking the Butt Out of All But Dissertations. You can move on to the next lesson if you're ready, which will be lesson number 12, where I'll tie everything together in chapter number 3.